in desperation mode, I bought a couple of, I think fifth season tags for Wisconsin and went over there and just to run and gun some public and just look around and just get out.
Yeah.
And man, I found two spots that that have an insane amount of deer potential. You know, there was a lot of hunter pressure there. I mean, there was a lot of evidence of people being in there, but what I noticed, and which was part of the reason I wanted to get you on, is how bad some of the stands were that were hung. You know, like none of those stands are supposed to still be up. They're all still up. You know, everybody leaves them up. And, you know, I'd find a trail coming out of, you know, some kind of just gnarly bedding area, thick stuff, and just an obvious funnel type thing covered in rubs. And then I'd look up in a tree and, you know, 12 feet up, facing right where you'd expect the deer to come from, is a stand on the most bare tree you can possibly imagine. I'm like, how do you possibly sit there without getting busted? And I see that over and over again. It made me realize, you know, like you're talking about how you set up for turkeys on the ground. We're thinking about like, okay, he approaches this way. When can I draw? He approaches this way. And you're putting some serious thought into it. I think a lot of people are missing the boat on that as far as just how they hang their stands and set up in trees.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a fear of heights thing or just a lack of overall understanding of how cagey public land deer can be. But yeah, I see a lot of stands like that too. And, you know, on another hand, there are situations, and you know this from hunting Nebraska and South Dakota and Kansas, there are situations where there's a really good spot to hunt where maybe the only possible thing that you can get into is like a cedar that's maybe the size of a baseball bat, and you got to kind of hollow it out, but at least you've got a backdrop, you know, to cover you. And, you know, honestly, deer don't see, they don't have the eyes of a turkey or an antelope. You know, the main thing is movement. But when you're skylined on a tree that has no backdrop whatsoever, it becomes a really tough proposition. And not just with, you know, you might fool fawns or yearling bucks, no problem, but the older does and the mature bucks, it's just not really something you're going to pull off a lot of times. I mean, yeah, if they're in the middle of the rut and they're totally focused on the doe that's darting through the area, well, you might pull it off. But honestly, it's really something I see too often where guys just, you know, they just don't put enough effort into really disguising their ambush setup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man. I mean, I hang facing away from where I expect the deer to come from almost always, just because of that. And, you know, I think about it, you know, you talk about those plain states and some of those western states, those whitetails are not paying attention as much. They're not getting hunted from trees as much. You can get away with a crazy amount of stuff with those deer hunting out of a tree than you can, you know, in Wisconsin, for example. Yeah. And I always think, like, you know, people probably disagree with this, but think about it. If, you know, we're probably dealing with 25 or 30 generations of deer that have been hunted pretty hard from tree stands. You know, like if you, you know, if every year you walked out into your yard and there were leopards up in the trees and, you know, every once in a while they grabbed one of your neighbors and they grabbed your kid, you'd start looking in the trees after a few generations, right? You'd think about that. And man, when I hunt over in Wisconsin and some of the places I hunt in Minnesota and in the Midwest, I'm just way more cognizant of that because those deer are looking up. You know, if you're a doe and you've raised fawns on public land, you're looking up because that's where the danger comes from an awful lot. And it's just a matter, sometimes it is just a matter of facing away from where you expect them to come. So by the time they're looking beyond for danger that's, you know, they're not thinking it's already there, or just getting yourself blended in with some limbs and stuff and breaking up your outline a little bit and not just being so, just sticking out so much. And, you know, it's like We've talked about this in the past on this podcast about trail cameras. I mean, there are places I hunt where deer don't pay attention to trail cameras at all, and there are places I hunt where I put a trail camera up and they freak out. And you think about them freaking out on a little tiny trail camera, and they're not going to freak out when there's a 185-pound person hanging off a tree when there wasn't before. Like, that's crazy. And so you kind of have to know what you're working with. And, you know, as a general rule, like you said, when you're on public land, man, you got to think about this stuff a little bit, maybe go a little bit higher than you normally would. Or pick a tree. You know, I think a lot of times we choose trees that are just too close to where the action is. You know, when you're shooting a deer, you know, a 10-yard shot's great, but a 20-yard shot is not hard to make. Like, you should be able to make a 20-yard shot. Get back off there a little bit. And, you know, like you said, sometimes it's a matter of just availability of the trees, right? You know, like, you might not have a ton of them, but a lot of times it's just making that choice to be closer than you really need to be and putting yourself in a position where you're probably going to get busted versus being back off the trail a little bit and giving yourself a little bit more of a cushion to be hidden and not right in their sight line.
Yeah. I think if I was to choose between being, you know, 15 feet up in a tree that's totally exposed, or maybe find a large trunked, say, oak tree that's, maybe 25 yards from the main trail versus the 10 or 15 that the skinny little tree is, I would pick the ground ambush because, you know, if you can back yourself up against that tree, you know, you're not skylined, the tree is your backdrop, and as long as you move at the right times, you know, it's a better setup. I think a lot of people, I fell into it last year in Iowa, honestly. The whole tree stands and trail camera, the thing that everybody is preaching, you know, when you turn on outdoor TV, you know, that's everybody's doing all that stuff and watching the wind to a T. And I ended up finding that sometimes you just got to hunt, and sometimes you just got to do what doesn't make sense, you know, or go against the grain a little bit. And I actually ended up killing not a really big Iowa buck, but a decent Iowa buck with my wife, crouched right next to me. We were on the ground. We went into a thicket where there was no trees even big enough for a tree stand. And, we bumped a doe and we just hunkered down, and my wife spotted a buck kind of going on the other side of the thicket. So I just popped out a couple grunts, and that deer came in to 15 yards, and we're hunkered in the open. I mean, we didn't have any big backdrop. But we were not upright, you know, we were hunkered down, and I shot that deer at 15 yards, and he honestly never knew that we were there. And so sometimes, like, you just got to break free of what you know and just try something different. You know, tree stands aren't the solve-all solution to not getting busted. I mean, sometimes it's the opposite. You just got to do what makes sense for the particular circumstance or the particular location that you're in. And so, you know, another barrier to entry, people think you got to have a garage full of tree stands to kill deer. No, not really. And especially nowadays with the saddles and stuff that are out, you can be a lot more mobile and hunt a lot more places if you're on public land like you and I primarily do. Sometimes all the tree stands and all the tree sticks and everything just weigh you down and take up space in your truck, you know?
Well, there is a good point there as far as just recognizing, okay, this situation needs to be hunted, and getting up in a tree doesn't make sense or isn't possible. And, you know, like what you're talking about there with being on the ground, I was thinking about this the other day. I would say probably at least a third of the bucks I've killed on public land have been from the ground. And a lot of times when you get into the situation where you're like, this spot's too good, I have to hunt it, regardless of how you hunt it, and you sit on the ground, I have no problem backing up 25 or 30 yards from where I think the deer are going to be, because shooting from the ground is easy. Like, you're not thinking about those angles, you know, other than, you know, too far forward or back or whatever, quartered away, quarter toward. But, you know, you think about like how much room you have to work with. If you're 30 yards off where they're going to be, you know, and people think, well, that's too far to set up. But I'm like, if you sat out on the ground in your yard and you put a deer target out at 30 yards, you should be able to hit that sucker in the lungs all day long. And it's the same thing when you get into the woods and you get that nice shot from the ground, but you're back and you can really tuck yourself into a little natural ground blind. Man, it can work so well, and it can just open up the possibility of hunting places that you normally wouldn't, like you're talking about down in Iowa. And instead of going in with that stand and sticks on your back and going, well, I carried this sucker in, I got to use it. Like that kind of that singularity of focus, it just opens up more possibilities, and it really takes you to places where you should be hunting because the deer are there versus looking for a place that's going to allow you to hunt the way you think you should.
Yeah. Well, and in Iowa, a lot of people, they want to go to the timber because that's, where the oaks are and that's where the so-called deer habitat is. Well, where I killed my buck is like pheasant country. I mean, it's wide open grass with, just a thicket. No trees, again, really big enough for a stand, nothing that would have made sense like that. So it gets you in places that other people aren't really hunting for deer. I mean, you might have the occasional pheasant hunter to deal with, but during the rut down there, in a lot of those states like that, the deer moving around all day long, and, what a shotgun hunter or a bird hunter did an hour ago, doesn't necessarily affect what happens an hour from now.
Yep.
And so getting yourself away from a lot of the bow hunters and putting yourself in places like that, it could be an isolated island of just nasty thick stuff where maybe your shots are 15 yards and in, like where I killed my buck. But yeah, getting into those places, like you said, puts you kind of in a way where you should be, because that's where they feel safe. They're not being bow hunted there very much, if at all.
That's where your does end up a lot of times. I mean, they're just going to move to where they're not getting harassed. And, you mentioned the pheasant hunter thing, and I talk about this a lot, man. I hunt pheasants a lot on public land, and the amount of big bucks that we jump in places where they shouldn't be is incredible. And it just goes to show you, like you said, everybody goes where the trees are, because it looks like where you should deer hunt. People want it kind of like fit into their, I mean, kind of, you see this out west with turkeys too, where like you want to be in the woods for turkeys, or you want to be on the edge of that meadow, but there's times where you get into that really sparse creek bottom, or you get someplace that just doesn't look like it should be, like cedar choke stuff, and that's where the birds are. And it's because you're not there, it's because most people aren't there, and it's seems simple, but it's very hard for us to get past what we believe about some of this stuff.
Yeah. Once you know a certain thing, and it's especially prevalent with people who are kind of set in their ways, kind of stubborn. I've been like that. But to break free of what we know and try stuff like that, there's a level of fear involved. Kind of like we were talking earlier with hunting turkeys with a bow without a ground blind. There's a level of fear because it's like, I might get that bird in, but I might not get the shot because I might not get drawn. And it's vice versa with deer hunting. Going into a thicket, a lot of people might think, well, I've never hunted off from the ground. I've never still hunted for deer. And it's like, what have you got to lose? Especially if you're hunting public land like you and I do. It's not like you're busting your prize 200-inch buck off from the property. You're out there trying to shoot, a respectable deer or whatever your goal is. And you learn so much. Zach Fehrenbaugh from Hunting Public and I were talking about this the other day. He's basically solely hunting off from the ground nowadays and killing his bucks that way. And he doesn't entirely rule tree stands out as a possibility sometime in the future, but that's how he's hunting right now, is just off from the ground.
Yep.
And he said that you just have the ability to learn so much more because you put yourself in places where you see sign that you wouldn't see. You find bedding areas that you might not know exist. You find tendencies for that specific area that you wouldn't know if you just hunted from a tree stand. So it's a lot about learning, and if you're okay with getting your butt handed to you the first couple times, well then, you're going to learn so much more and end up being more successful because you're branching out and you're not just limiting yourself to one tactic.